All right. Area Studies, Middle East. Happy Monday. I know I'm gone at a golf tournament, but my spirit lives on as we're going to do more notes. Get pumped. This thing's happening. All right. We're going to look at Iran, some background, and we're going to mainly delve into the 20th century here. From colonialism to the first Shah to the second Shah, all the way up to the infamous revolution of 1979. So get out that paper, make those Cornell note sheets. Sorry, I don't have any for you. And let's get started. All right. We'll do this before lunch with the help of my fabulous guest teacher. Then when we get back, they're going to play the 20th Century History, a CBS video in which they actually interview the second Shah of Iran, even a couple of segments with the Ayatollah himself. It's really pretty good. You guys are going to enjoy it. So have fun with that, and let's get started with what we got here. All right. So we have the makeup of Iran here. This is basically kind of the people that live in the area. And it's a little bit more diverse than most people give it credit for. Now, the vast majority of people who live in Iran, their main ethnicity is Persian. We went over the Persia Empire notes earlier. Persians speak Farsi, all right? And that's probably, if we were to break it down, it's probably about 87% of the country. When we go up into the northwest, we have Azeri Turks, otherwise known as Azerbaijani, and that's because the country of Azerbaijan is very close to the Iran border up there. They're probably the second largest ethnic group. Then you have all along that kind of the northern Middle East area, whether it's Turkey, northern Iraq, or northwestern Iran, you have a substantial group of Kurds. The Kurds are an ethnic group that do not have their own country at this time. They would love to start one called Kurdistan, but that is not in the cards for this part of Iran. You also have a group of Arabs, and Arabs mostly live along the Iraqi border, so also on the west side. All right? That's the general makeup of ethnic groups in Iran. Now, as far as minorities go, Zoroastrians, they're those that follow the ancient religion, all right? Now, Zoroastrianism is thought to be one of the oldest, maybe second oldest to Judaism, of monotheistic religions in the world. And although most people, just hardly any, a fraction, actually follow the religion anymore, it's still, culturally, it's very important in Iran. It's part of their Persian heritage. You still have a handful of holiday traditions that started because of Zoroastrianism. Actually, Zoroastrians mostly have moved into India. There's quite a big pocket of Zoroastrians in Bombay, for example, that are quite wealthy and influential in that city. So it's kind of like Buddhism. Buddhism started in India, but maybe 1% of Indians actually practice Buddhism, but it spread to other places and got popular. Now, Zoroastrianism is not anywhere close on the scale of Buddhism, but it's kind of like that. It started in Iran. They keep some of the traditions, but most people that practice it have kind of moved on. All right. Now, Armenians are a very small minority that live in the Northwest, and they are actually officially protected by law because of the problems that they've had in the past with discrimination. And finally, one of the smallest minorities now in Iran, especially since the 1979 revolution, are the Jews. And with all the threatening rhetoric, easy for me to say, between Israel and Iran, it surprises a lot of people that not only are Jews a minority that lives in Iran, but really quite respected minority. Now, a lot of the community, there was probably about 150,000 Jews that lived in Iran at one time. Something like 80,000 of them moved right when the revolution started, kind of fearing for their safety with the conservative Islamic takeover. But the ones that remained, as things kind of settled in, really found out that they maybe didn't need to worry as much as they did. It's thought that Jews have lived in Iran with some kind of numbers for close to 2 millennia now. We'll go ahead and Mr. or Miss guest teacher, I don't know who I have here today. Go ahead and pause, and if you want to pause here on the video, these guys can kind of get this stuff copied down. Now, when we go into 20th century history of Iran, and mostly I'm going to start post World War I, so around 1920. But if you go into pre-World War I, the very beginning of the 20th century, Russia and Britain had divided what was then called Persia into two spheres of influence. All right, so Russia had they had the west side, and they were kind of interested in access to the Caspian Sea and being able to get to the Persian Gulf. Britain had the eastern half, and what they were hoping for was that buffer zone, since Iran borders on what's today Pakistan, but back then was part of British India. So they both kind of had what they wanted. Now, after the war, the British negotiated to have Persia as a protectorate. So they tried to stay on and make it a colony, something that the Persians wanted no part of. And so all of these smaller groups that lived within Persia, like the Armenians or the Azerbaijanis, every group seemed to be wanting independence to create their own country, but it's the Persians that were able to take control of their own territory. And that's thanks in 1921 to a peasant and his group of Cossacks that were able to take control of the region, and that was Reza Khan. And Reza Khan, the peasant army leader, was able to take over in just a couple of years. The British really didn't put up too much of a fight. They thought it was going to be easy to keep Persia as a colony. When it turned out to be difficult, they kind of got out of there. And by 1925, Islamic leaders in the country convinced him to take the title of Reza Shah, and his family name was changed to something a little more fancy or a little bit more cultured, and his family name became Pahlavi. And this is going to be the first Shah of Iran, as Reza Shah changed the name from Persia, which was kind of a Greek term for the area that they lived in, and changed it to the more kind of traditional Farsi name of Iran. Go ahead and pause here and make sure we get everybody getting all this stuff down on the slide. Now, this first Shah, Reza, is really able to make quite a few changes to what he's going to think is going to be modern Iran. A lot of the religious leaders of Shia Islam, that were in the country, really thought that this guy was going to be a pawn, somebody for them to use and kind of make Iran a religious state. And that really just wasn't the case. He always had sought to gain control of the masses. He envisioned himself being this all-powerful king that was going to be able to modernize the state. Now, this meant that there was going to be numerous kind of violent infighting, especially in the late 20s into the early 30s, with Shia clerics and their supporters. However, he was able to emerge, and he was able, in a lot of ways, through friendships with not only the British but the French and the U.S., to get the means, whether it was borrowing money or borrowing technology, to kind of modernize the country. Now, where Reza Shah ran into trouble is, as the war was approaching, his ideology, he felt like he lined up with the charismatic leadership of one Adolf Hitler. So in other words, he became a supporter of Nazi Germany. And this is not going to sit well, with the people who thought they were handling him in the U.S. Eventually, during World War II, the U.S. and the Soviet Union jointly, once they teamed up in World War II, went into Iran, captured the Shah, sent him into exile. You are not allowed, to be our stooge in Iran anymore, Reza, if you're supporting the Nazis. So, boom, he's out. His son Muhammad takes over. A very young man at the time, in his 20s, and Reza never returned again. He died outside of the country. Let's go ahead and pause here so we can get all this down. All right, so like I said, the new Shah was just in his 20s. Actually, he was 22 years old. And after the war was over, you had the Soviets they were kind of catting around North Iran, trying to convert the Iranians, maybe the government, through the Kurds and the Azerbaijanis, hoping to get a little communist revolution started there. However, that was sunk. The United States had the Truman Doctrine. They used the best American weapon that they had available to them at the time, and that was mountains of green, lots of money, all right? And they made that happen. But really, none of this stuff, the Soviet intrigue trying to convert Iran into communism, it wasn't even as close to happening as was the threat that's going to come from his own people, who thought the Shah to be kind of lifeless, a little boring. He didn't seem to know what he was doing. The guy was just too young. And he did have prime ministers that would help him run the country. And one of the prime ministers that was elected from 51 to 53 was Mohammad Mossadegh. And Mohammad Mossadegh turned out to be quite the opponent for the Shah. As a matter of fact, he took his election and kind of ran with it. A very charismatic individual. This was a guy that had some of the most famous televised speeches in Iran of all time. He'd go into these rages or just start crying. He was like this dramatic speaker that got everybody all in an uproar. But it was what he was doing in economics that was making the Iranians just really, really support this guy. This is going to be the dude that nationalizes the oil economy in Iran. In other words, he takes over the oil companies' stuff, and all of those oil companies are American or European, and he's going to kind of keep the profits for the government's own bidding. And of course Iranians figured that they would get the money eventually themselves. So this was supported by the people, and really by 1953 it looked like the Shah was out for good, and Mossadegh was going to take over the country. We'll go ahead and pause here, let everybody get this down. Now, so when we look at Mossadegh and oil, and there's a picture of the guy right there, you can see he's an interesting looking character, and the dude was so emotional. So he's responsible for nationalizing Iranian oil, taking it from the British. But there were American companies there as well. Extremely popular for this. However, the United States was not in line with this. This was a guy that was not going to be their stooge, and they wanted stable leadership, meaning pro-U.S. leadership that was going to be in place in Iran. All right, so the U.S. and the Shah, they plot an overthrow. Mossadegh tries to, he kind of thwarts the first one, but eventually the CIA and MI6 team up together, and within the year they overthrow Mossadegh and they put the Shah back in power. And this is kind of in mid-1954, and from then on, the Shah's tactics got tough. He kind of learned his lesson. It's like, just because somebody told me I was Shah doesn't mean I get to keep it. If I want to hold on to this position, I better get myself a backbone. And he got that and then some. I think most Iranians would agree. So let's go ahead and get the rest of this on paper.